3. Mars, AD 2094.
Narrated by Felipe Pacheco.
The calendar clock tells me that, at home, it is breakfast time on the 24th of June. There's no reason, as far as I can see, why that should not be so. If it is, I must have been on Mars for exactly 10 weeks. Quite a time, and I wonder how many more weeks to follow. One day, other people will come here and find at least the ship. I ought to have tried to keep a regular log, but it did not seem worthwhile, and anyway, it wouldn't have been regular for long. I have not been quite myself, but now that I have faced facts, I am calmer, almost resigned, and I find myself feeling that it would be more creditable not to leave simply a mystery. Someone is sure to come one day, better not to leave him to unravel it by inference alone, and perhaps wrongly. There are some things I want to say, and some I ought to say. Besides, it will give me something to occupy my mind. That is rather important to me. I don't want to lose my hold on my mind again if I can help it. Funny, it is the early things that stick. There used, I remember, to be an old drawing room song to impress the ladies. Let me like a soldier fall. Hammy, of course, and yet. But no need to hurry. There is, I think, still some time to go. I've come out on the other side of something, and now I find in the thought of death a calmness. It is so much less frightening than the thought of life in this place. My regrets have turned outwards. The chief of them is for the distress my Isabella must now be feeling, and for the anxieties I must leave her to face alone as George and Anna grow up. I do not know who is going to read what I am writing. One supposes that it will be some member of an expedition that knows all about us up to the time of our landing. We gave the bearings of our landing place on the radio, so there should be no great difficulty in finding the ship where she now lies, but one cannot be sure. Possibly the message was not received. There may be reasons why a long time will pass before she is found. It could even be that she will be discovered accidentally by someone who never heard of us. So, after all, an account may serve better than a log. I introduce myself. Trunho, Capitão Geoffrey Montgomery Trunho of the Space Division of the Skyforce of Brazil, lately of Avenida 8 de Maio, 138, Pretário, Minas Gerais, Brasil, América do Sul. Citizen of the Estados Unidos do Brasil, aged 28 years. Navigator and sole surviving crew member of the EUB space vessel Figurão. I am Brasileiro by birth. My grandfather and my father were formerly British subjects and became Brazilian by naturalization in the year 2056, at which time they changed the name from Troon to Trunho for phonetic convenience. Our family has a space tradition. My great-great-grandfather was the famous Ticker Troon, the one who rode the rocket at the building of the first space station. My great-grandfather was commander of the British moon station at the time of the Great Northern War, and it is likely that my grandfather would have followed him there later, but for the war. It so happened, however, that the war broke out during my grandfather's term of groundwork at the British Space House, or, to be more accurate, at one of the Space House's secret and deep-dug operational centers. And it happened further that the actual outbreak of hostilities occurred when he was off base. He was, in fact, on leave in Jamaica, where he had taken his wife, my grandmother, and my father, then aged 6, on a visit to his mother's recently bought house. Many books have been written since the event, showing that the war was inevitable and that the high councils knew it to be inevitable. But my grandfather always denied that. He maintained that on the highest levels, no less than in the public mind, it had come to be thought of as the war that would never happen. Our leaders may have been foolish. They may, in a long state of deadlock, have been too easily lulled. But they were not criminal lunatics, and they knew what a war must mean. There were, of course, incidents that caused periodical waves of panic, but however troublesome they may have been to trade and to the stock markets, they were not taken very seriously on the higher political levels, and from a service point of view, were even felt not to be a bad thing. Had the never-happen attitude been quite unperturbed, there would, without doubt, have been cuts in service allocations. Technical progress would have suffered in consequence, and too much of a falling behind could conceivably mean that the other fellows would have gained enough ascendancy and superiority in armament to make them think a quick war worth risking. In the opinion of his own department, my grandfather asserted, an actual outbreak seemed no more likely than it had seemed 2 years or 5 years or 10 years before. Their work was going on as usual, organizing, reorganizing, and superseding in the light of new discoveries, playing a kind of chess in which one's pieces were lost, not to the opponent, but to obsolescence. There never has been, according to him, any conclusive proof that the war was not touched off by some megalomaniac, or even by accident. It had long been axiomatic on both sides that, should missiles arrive, the form was to get one's own missiles into the air as soon as possible and hit the enemy's potential as fast and as hard as one could. And, in 2044, there was little that could not be considered a part of his potential, from his factories to the morale of his people and the health of his crops. So, one night, my grandfather went to sleep in a world where peace was no more restive than it had been for years, and in the morning, he awoke in one that had been at war for 4 hours, with casualties already high in the millions. All over North America, all over Europe, all over the Russian Empire, there were flashes that paled the sun, heat waves that seared and set on fire whole countrysides. Monstrous plumes were writhing up into the sky, shedding ashes, dust, and death. My grandfather was immediately obsessed by his duty, his obligation to get back somehow to his post, which was that section of the British service located in northern Canada. For 2 days, he spent nearly all his time in Kingston, badgering the authorities and anyone else he could find. There were plenty of aircraft there, plenty of all kinds, large airlines, crowded freighters, small, owner-flown machines, but they were all coming from the north, most of them pausing only to refuel and then fleeing on, like migrating birds, to the south. Nothing took off for the north. Communications were chaotic. No one could tell what fields were still available, still less how long they would remain so. Pilots resolutely refused to take the risk, even for large sums, and the airport authorities backed them up by refusing to sanction any northward flights with an impregnability against which my grandfather and numbers of anxious United States citizens battered in vain. On the evening of the second day, however, he succeeded in buying someone out of a seat on a southbound aircraft and set off with the intention of making a circuit via Porto Natal in Brazil, Dakar, and Lisbon, and so to England, where he hoped to be able to find a service machine to get him to Canada. In point of fact, he arrived at Freetown, Sierra Leone, about 8 days later and got no further. News there was still scarce and contradictory, but there was enough of it to convince not merely pilots, but everyone else that even if an aircraft should safely get through, a landing almost anywhere in Europe would mean delayed, if not immediate, suicide. It took him 2 months to get home again to Jamaica, by which time, of course, the Northern War was almost history. It was, however, such recent history that the non-combatants were still numbed by the shock. The near paralysis of fright, which had held everyone outside the war zone for a month, was relaxed, but people had still not fully got over their astonishment at finding themselves and their homes surviving undamaged. Still persisting, too, was that heightened awareness which made each new, untroubled day seem a gracious gift, rather than a right. There was a dazed pause, a sense of coming to again, before the worries of life swept back. And all too soon, the worries were plentiful, not only over radiation, active dusts, contaminated water, diseases threatening both flora and fauna, and such immediate matters, but also over the whole problem of reorientation in a world where most of a hemisphere had become a malignant, unapproachable desert. Jamaica, it was clear, was not going to have much to offer except exports, for which there was virtually no market. It could sustain itself. One might be able to go on living there with much diminished standards, but it was certainly no place to build a new life. My grandmother was in favor of a move to South Africa, where her father was chairman of a board of a small aircraft company. She argued that my grandfather's knowledge and experience would make him a useful addition to the board, and that with most of the great aircraft factories of the world now destroyed, a tremendous growth of the company was inevitable. My grandfather was unenthusiastic, but he did go as far as to pay a visit there to talk the matter over with his father-in-law. He returned unconverted, however. He was not, he said, at all taken with the place. There was something about it that made him uneasy. My grandmother, though disappointed, refrained from pressing the matter, which turned out to be fortunate, for a little over a year later, her father and all her relatives there were among the millions who died in the Great African Rising. But before that took place, my grandfather had made his own decision. China, he said, is not out, but she has been very badly mauled and reduced. It will take her a long time to recover. Japan has suffered out of proportion to the material damage there because of the concentration of her population. India is weakened, as usual, by her internal troubles. Africa has been kept backward. Australia is the center of the surviving British and may one day become an important nation, but it will take time. South America, however, is intact and looks to me to be the natural focus of world power in the immediate future, and that means either Brazil or the Argentine. I should be very much surprised indeed if it were to turn out to be Argentina, so we shall go to Brazil. To Brazil, then, he went, offering his technical knowledge. Almost immediately, he was put in charge of the then rudimentary space division of the Brazilian Sky Force to organize the annexation of the battered satellites, to dispatch provision missiles to the British moon station, and then to direct its relief, the rescue of its company, including his father, and its annexation, together with that of the entire lunar territory, to the Estados Unidos do Brasil. The cost of this enterprise, particularly at such a time, was considerable, but it proved to be well justified. Prestige has varied sources. In spite of the fact that the moon stations and the satellites had exerted an infinitesimal and almost self-canceling effect upon the Northern War, the knowledge that they were now entirely in Brazilian hands, and perhaps the thought that whenever the moon rose, one was being overlooked from Brazilian territory, undoubtedly made a useful contribution to the ascendancy of the Brasileiros at a time when the disordered remnant of the world was searching for a new center of gravity. Once he had the space project well in hand, my grandfather, though not yet a Brazilian citizen, was given the leadership of a mission to British Guiana, where he pointed out the advantages that an amputated colony would derive from integration, on terms of full equality of citizenship with a powerful neighbor. The ex-colony, already uneasily conscious of pressure on its western border from Venezuela, accepted the offer. A few months later, Suriname and French Guiana followed its example, and the Caribbean Federation signed a treaty of friendship with Brazil. In Venezuela, the government, bereft of North American support and markets, fell to a short, sharp revolution, whose leaders also elected for integration with Brazil. Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru hastened to sign treaties of support and friendship. Chile concluded a defensive alliance with Argentina. Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay were drawn together into nervous neutrality and declarations of goodwill toward both their powerful neighbors. My grandfather took out his naturalization papers and became a loyal and valued citizen of the Republic. My father graduated from the University of São Paulo in 2062 with a master's degree in extraterrestrial engineering, and then spent several years at the government testing station in the Rio Branco. It had long been my grandfather's contention that the development of spacecraft was not simply a matter of prestige, as some thought, and certainly not the expensive frivolity that others proclaimed it, but a wise precaution that would someday prove its worth. For one thing, he argued, if Brazil were to neglect space, someone else would take it over. For another, there would arise, sooner or later, the need for an economic space freighter. The whole foundation of modern technology rested upon metals, and with the rich metalliferous areas of Canada, Siberia, and Alaska now unworkable, with Africa absorbing all she could mine, India in the market for all she could buy, and South America consuming at an increasing rate, the shortages already apparent in the rarer metals would become more extensive and more acute. The cost, when it should become necessary to seek them in sources outside the Earth, was bound to be great. At present, it would be prohibitive, but he did not believe it need remain prohibitive. If practical freighters were developed, it could mean that one day Brazil might have a monopoly of at least the rarer metals and metalliferous earths. How much faith my father had in the argument behind the policy, I do not know. I think it possible that he did not know either, but used it simply for the problems it raised. And out of all these, his heartiest and most favorite concerned what he called the crate, his name for an economical, unmanned freighter and the space-assembled cruiser. Numbers of crates of various types exist on his drawing boards, but the cruisers, craft radically different in conception from those that must resist the stresses of takeoff against the pull of gravity, still remain somewhat fluid in conception. I myself, though I inherit my family's almost pathological interest in matters beyond the ionosphere, do not share my father's ability to sublimate it in theory and design. Wherefore, after taking my degree at São Paulo, I attended the Skyforce Academy and was duly commissioned in the Space Division. A family connection has its uses. I should not, I am sure, have received preference over better qualified men, but when the original list of 20 volunteers for the appointment of navigator aboard the Figurão had been whittled down to 4, all equally qualified, I suspect that the name Trunho and Troon before it had some influence on the decision. Raul Capaneiro, our commander, very likely owed his selection to not unsimilar circumstances, for his father was a marshal in the Skyforce. But it was not so with Camilo Botões. He was with us simply because he was unique. His intention of visiting another planet seems to have been formed about the time he was in his cradle, and not a great deal later, it would appear, he had conceived the idea that some unusual qualification would give him an advantage over the one-line man. He set out to acquire it, with the result that when the call for volunteers came, the Skyforce discovered with some surprise that it had among its personnel a capable electronics officer who was also a geologist, and not merely a dabbler, but one whose published papers made it impossible to ignore his competence to produce a preliminary study in areology. My own appointment to the crew troubled my mother and distressed my poor Isabella, but its effect on my father was dichotomous. The Figurão, the big shot, was the product of his department, and largely of his own ideas. Its success would give him a place in history as the designer of the first interplanetary link. If I were to go with it, his connection would be still more personal, making the venture something of a family affair. On the other hand, I am his only son, and he was sharply conscious that the very best of his skill, care, and knowledge must still leave the ship at the mercy of numerous unguessed hazards. The thought that he would be exposing me to risks he had been unable to foresee and could not guard against was in painful conflict with his awareness that any objections he might make to my going would be construed as a lack of confidence in his own work. Thus, I put him in a rendingly difficult situation, and now I wish, almost more than anything else, that I had the means to tell him that it is not through any shortcoming of his that I shall not be going home to Earth. The launch took place on the 9th of December, a Wednesday. The preliminary jump was quite uneventful, and we followed the usual supply rocket practice in our intersection with the satellite orbit and in taking up station close to the satellite itself. I felt sentimentally glad that the station was ep03. It made the expedition even more of a family affair, for it was the first space station, the one that my great-great-grandfather had helped to build, though I suppose that most parts of it must have been replaced on account of war and other damage since those days. We crossed over to Primera and put in more than a week of Earth days there, while the Figurão's atmosphere protection envelope was removed and she was refueled and fully provisioned. The three of us carried out tests in our various departments and made a few necessary minor adjustments. Then we waited, almost wishing there had been more readjustments to keep us occupied, until Primera, the Moon, and Mars were in the relative positions calculated for our takeoff. At last, however, on Tuesday, the 22nd of December, at 0335 RMT, we made blast and launched ourselves on the main journey. I shall not deal here with the journey itself. All technical information concerning it has been entered by Raul in the official log, which I shall enclose with this supplementary account in a metal box. What I have written so far has two purposes. One is, as I have said, to cover the possibility that it may not be found for a very long time. The other is to provide factual material by which any more imminent finder may check my mental condition. I have read carefully through it myself, and, to me, it appears to offer sufficient evidence that I am sane and coherent, and I trust that that will be the opinion of others who may read it, and that they may therefore consider what follows to be equally valid. The final entry in the log will be seen to record that we were approaching Mars on a spiral. The last message we sent before landing will be found on the file. About to attempt landing area Isidis Certis Major, intended location, longitude 275, latitude 48. When Camilo had dispatched that message, he swung the transmitter across on its bracket to lock it safely against the wall, and then lay back on his couch. Raul and I were already in position on ours. My work was finished, and I had nothing to do but wait. Raul had the extension control panel clamped across his couch in a position where he would still be able to operate it against the pressure of several gravities if necessary. Everything had gone according to expectations, except that our outer surface temperature was somewhat higher than had been calculated, suggesting that the atmosphere is a trifle denser than has been assumed. But the error was small and of little practical significance. Raul set about adjusting the angle of the ship, tilting her to preserve the inclination in relation to the braking thrust as we slowed. Our couches turned on their gimbals as the speed decreased, and the braking thrust of the main tubes gradually became our vertical support. Finally, when the speed was virtually zero and we were standing balanced on our discharge, his job too was over. He switched in the landing control and lay back, watching the progress of our descent on the dials. Beneath us, there now splayed downwards 8 narrow radar beams matched for proximity, and each controlling a small lateral firing tube. The least degree of tilt was registered by one or more of the beams and corrected by a short blast, which restored the ship to balance on the point of the main drive. Another beam, directed vertically downwards, controlled the force of the main drive itself, relating it to the distance of the surface below and thus regulating the speed of descent. The arrangement lowered us smoothly, and there was only the slightest of lurches as our supporting tripod set down. Then the drive cut out, vibration ceased, and an almost uncanny peace set in. No one spoke. The completeness of the silence began to be broken by the ticking and clicking of metal cooling off. Presently, Raul sat up and loosed his safety straps. "Well, we're there. Your old man did a good job," he said to me. He got off his couch carefully, cautious of the unfamiliar feeling of gravity, and made for the nearest port. I did the same and started to unscrew its cover. Camilo swung the radio over on its bracket and transmitted. Figurão landed safely Mars 0343 RMT 18494. Location believed as stated. Will observe and verify. Then, he too reached for the nearest port cover. The view, when I had my port uncovered, was much what I had expected. An expanse of hummocky, rust-red desert sand reaching away to the horizon. Anywhere else, it would have been the least exciting of all possible views, but it was not anywhere else. It was Mars, seen as no one had ever seen it before. We did not cheer, we did not slap one another on the back, we just went on, staring at it. At last, Raul said, rather flatly, There it is then. Miles and miles of nothing. And all of it ours. He turned away and went over to a row of dials. Atmosphere about 15% denser than predicted. That accounts for the overheating, he said. We'll have to wait for the hole to cool down a bit before we can go out. Oxygen content very low indeed. By the look of things, most of it has been tied up in oxidizing these deserts. He went over to a locker and started pulling out spacesuits and gear. He did it clumsily. After weeks of weightlessness, it is difficult to remember that things will drop if you let go of them. Funny that error about atmosphere density, said Camilo. Not so very, Raul replied. Just that someone's crackpot theory about air leaking away into space got written into the assumptions, I reckon. Why the devil should it leak away unless there's a large body around to attract it? Might as well suggest that our own atmosphere is leaking to the moon and then back again. Beats me how these loony propositions get a foot in, but I expect we'll find plenty more of them. Were they wrong about gravity too? I asked. I seem to feel a lot heavier than I expected. No, that's as calculated. Just a matter of getting used to weight itself, he said. I crossed the floor and looked through the ports that he had uncovered. The view was almost the same as through mine, though not quite, for in that direction, the meeting of sand and sky was marked by a thin, dark line. I wondered what it was. At that distance, I could see no detail, nor, indeed, judge how far away the horizon was. I turned back, intending to find the eyepiece that would adapt the telescope, but at that moment, the floor shifted under my feet. The whole room canted over suddenly, sliding me across the floor. The heavy port cover swung over. It just missed me, but it caught Raul and sent him slamming against the main control board. The room tilted more. I was flung back on the couch I had just left, and I clung to it. Camilo came sliding past, trying to grab at the couch supports to stop himself. There were several thuds, a clatter, and finally, a kind of crunching crash, which set me bouncing on the couch springs. When I looked around, I found that what had, for the brief period since our landing, been the floor had become a vertical wall. Obviously, the figuron had toppled over and now lay on its side. Camilo was huddled in the angle made by the erstwhile floor and the curved wall, all mixed up with the spacesuits and their accessories. Raul was spread-eagled over the control board, and I could see blood trickling across it. I dropped off the couch and approached Raul. I started to lift his head, but it did not come easily. Then, I found out why. It had crashed down on one of the control levers, and the handle had gone in at the temple. There was nothing to be done for him. I scrambled across and looked at Camilo. He was unconscious, but there was no visible damage. His pulse was strong enough, and I set about trying to bring him round. Several minutes went by before his eyes opened, and they looked at me, screwed up, with lids fluttering and closed again. I found some brandy. Presently he sighed, and his eyes opened again. They looked at me, wondered about the control room, and came back to me again. Mars, he said. Mars, the bloody planet. Is this Mars? There was a silly look about him that made my spirit sink. Yes, this is Mars, I told him. I lifted him onto one of the couches and made him comfortable there. His eyes closed and he went off again. I looked round. The only part of the equipment, other than the spacesuits that had been loose, was the radio transmitter. Camilo, after using it, had pushed it aside, leaving it free to swing on its bracket. It had done just that and been stove in when it met one of the couches, turning in its gimbals. It looked suitable for writing off. I couldn't just sit there, doing nothing but look at the other two, so I disentangled one suit and coupled it up with its air supply and batteries and tested it. It worked perfectly. The thermometer giving the outside hole reading was down quite a bit from what it had been, and I decided to go outside to find the trouble. Fortunately, as the ship lay, the airlock was at the side, the right side as one faced forward. Had it been underneath, it would have been extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get out at all. Even as we lay, it was awkward enough, for the lock had been built to accommodate 2 men standing, and now one had to sit doubled up inside it. It worked, however, though when the outer door opened, the telescopic ladder could not be made to project at a suitable angle. I had to get out by jumping down 6 feet or so, and my first contact with the surface of Mars was undignified. To stand there at last was, in the event, depressing. Not just because the only view was arid miles of red sand, but even more, because I was alone. It was the moment we had thought and talked of for so long, worked so hard for, risked so much for. And this was all. Anticlimax there would surely have been, but it would have been less dreary with someone to share it, with a little ceremony to mark the occasion. Instead, I just stood there, alone. Under the small, weak sun, in the purplish sky, I was dwindled to a tiny living mote with a barren wilderness pressing all about me. Not that it was different from my expectations. In fact, it looked only too like them, and yet I knew now that in all my imaginings, I had never remotely touched its real quality. I had thought of it as empty and neutral, never suspected its implicit hostility. Yet, there was nothing there, nothing to be afraid of, except the worst thing of all, fear itself. The fear that has no cause, shape, or center. That same amorphous fear that used to come creeping out of the dark, massing to invade the safety of one's childish bed. I could feel the old panic, forgotten for so many years, rising up again. I was back in my infant self. All that I had learned in the years between seemed to vanish. Once more, I was the defenseless, beset by the incomprehensible. I wanted to run back to the ship, as to my mother, for safety. I all but did that. Yet, not quite. A vestige of my rational mind helped me there. It kept on telling me that if I gave in to panic now, it would be far worse the next time, and the time after. And gradually, while I stood, the vestige gathered the strength to push the panic back. Soon, I could feel it winning, like warm blood flowing in. Then, I felt better. I was able to force some objectivity. I looked carefully round. From this low viewpoint, there was no trace anywhere of the dark line that I had seen through the port when the figuran was vertical. All the way round, red sand met purple sky in an endless, even line. There was nothing at all on the face of the desert but the ship and myself under the center of a vast, upturned bowl. Then I made myself pay attention to the ship. It was easy to see what had happened. Below the light dust of the surface, the sand had formed a crust. Our weight had caused the pediment plate on one of the tripod legs to break through the crust, and we had toppled over. I wondered for a moment if Raul would be able to contrive some way of getting us vertical again, and then suddenly recollected why he would not. I went back into the ship and looked for something to dig with. Camilo had not moved and appeared to have fallen into a natural sleep. Luckily, someone had thought of equipping the ship with a sort of entrenching tool. It was small, but it would have to do. Getting Raul outside was unpleasant and far from easy, but I managed it, laid him on the sand while I dug. That was not easy work either, in a spacesuit, and I thought it might take me several shifts. But at about 12 inches down, I suddenly broke through and found myself looking into a black hole. Considering the misadventure to the ship, it seemed possible that the place was honeycombed with such cavities. I enlarged the hole a little until I was able to slide poor Raul into it. Then, I blocked the opening with a slab of caked sand, covered it as best I could, and went back to the ship again. I came out of the airlock to find that Camilo was now awake. Not only awake, but sitting up on his couch, regarding me with nervous intensity. "I don't like Martians," he said. I looked at him more carefully. His expression was serious and not at all friendly. "I don't suppose I would either," I admitted, keeping my tone matter-of-fact. His expression became puzzled, then wary. He shook his head. "Very cunning lot, you Martians," he remarked. After we had had a meal, he seemed a little better, though from time to time I caught him watching me carefully out of the corner of his eye. Indeed, he was paying so much attention to me that it was some time before it occurred to him that there should be 3 of us. "Where's Raul?" he asked. I explained what had happened to Raul, showed him the switch lever that had done the fatal damage, and pointed out through the port the place where Raul now lay. He listened closely and nodded several times, though not always where a nod seemed appropriate. It was difficult to know whether he was not quite grasping the situation or whether he was making reservations of his own. He did not show distress about Raul, only a quiet thoughtfulness, and after he had sat in silent rumination on the matter for a quarter of an hour, it began to get on my nerves. To break it up, I showed him the radio transmitter. It's taken a pretty nasty bash," I said, somewhat unnecessarily. "Do you think you can get it going again?" Camilo looked it over for some minutes. "It certainly has," he agreed. "Yes," I said impatiently, "but the point is, can you fix it?" He turned his head and looked at me steadily. "You want to get into touch with Earth," he announced. "Of course we do. They'll be expecting reports from us right now. They know our time of landing, but that's all so far. We've got to put in an immediate report about Raul and about the state of the ship. Tell them the mess we're in." He considered that in an unhurried way and then shook his head, doubtfully. "I don't know," he said. "You're so cunning, you Martians." "Oh, for heaven's sake," I began, but then made a quick decision that it might be unwise to antagonize him. Rather than drive him into obstinacy, I tried to put across a calmly persuasive line. He listened, patiently, with a slight frown, as one taking into consideration every possible angle. At the end, still without committing himself on whether he thought he could make the radio work or not, he said that it was an important matter that required thinking over. I could only hold my temper for fear of setting up a worse conflict in his mind. He retreated to his couch and lay on it, presumably to do his important thinking. I stood looking out of the port a while and then, realizing that the day would soon be coming to an end, got out the color camera and busied myself with making the first records ever of the stages of a Martian sunset. This was not a spectacular affair. The small sun grew somewhat redder as it dropped towards the horizon. As it disappeared from sight, the sky turned immediately from purple to black, all except a wispy stretch of cloud, quite surprising to me, which still caught the rays, glowing pinkly for a minute or two, and then vanished. Looking through another port, I could see a small bright disk just above the rim, and climbing almost visibly up the spangled blackness. I took it to be Phobos and turned the telescope onto it. It does not appear to be of any great interest, not unlike our own moon, but less mountainous and much less cratered. All the time, I was uneasily conscious of Camilo. Whenever I took a look in his direction, I found his head turned my way and his eyes watching me in a speculative fashion that was difficult to disregard. I did my best, however, and busied myself with fixing the camera to the telescope. The speed of the satellite rendered it none too easy to keep it centered in the field of view, but I made a number of exposures. Camilo had fallen asleep again by the time I had finished, and I was tired enough to be glad to get on my own couch. Once I had dropped off, I slept heavily. When I awoke, there was daylight outside the ports, and Camilo standing beside one of them looking out. He must have heard me move, for he said, without turning, "I don't like Mars." "Nor do I agreed. But then, I never expected to. "Funny thing," he said. "I got it into my head last night that you were a Martian." "Sorry. You had a nasty knock," I told him. "Must have shaken you up quite a bit. How are you feeling now?" "Oh, all right. Bit of a muzzy headache. It'll pass." "Damn silly of me thinking you were a Martian. You're not a bit like one, really." I was in the middle of a yawn and failed to finish it properly. "What?" I inquired, with some caution. "What are Martians like?" "That's the trouble," he said, still looking out the port. "It's so hard to see them properly. They're so quick. When you're looking at one place, you see a flicker of them moving in another, just out the corner of your eye, and by the time you look there, they're somewhere else." "Oh," I said. "But, I never noticed any when I was outside yesterday." "Ah, but you weren't looking for them," Camilo pointed out, and truly. I swung my feet off the couch. "What about some breakfast?" I suggested. He agreed, but remained by the window while I set about getting things ready. An awkward job with a curved wall for a floor and everything at right angles from its intended position. Now and then he would glance quickly from one side of the view to the other, often with a little sound of exasperation, as though he had just missed something again. It was irritating, but on the whole, a slight improvement on being taken for a Martian myself. "Come and eat," I told him when I had the food ready. "They'll keep." He left the port with some reluctance, but started in on the food with a good appetite. "Do you think you'll be able to fix the radio?" I inquired presently. "Maybe," he said. "But is it wise?" "Why the devil shouldn't it be?" I demanded, with some restraint. "Well," he explained, "they might intercept our messages, and if they learn what a mess we're in, it could very likely encourage them to attack." "We'll have to take a chance on that. The important thing is for us to get in touch with home and see what they suggest. It seems to me possible, just possible, that we may be able to get the ship back to the vertical somehow, with the gravitation as low as it is. I can plot the course and time of takeoff and look after that side, but can we manage her without Raul? He was the one with experience and special training. I have a general idea of the controls, and I suppose you have, but it is only general. This ship isn't built to stand up to the strains of ordinary takeoffs. That's why she had to have a special casing to get her from the Earth to Primera. She must have a specially calculated program of safe velocities for takeoff from here, and that will have to be amended on account of the atmosphere being denser than was reckoned. We don't want to burn her up or melt her tubes. As things are, I don't begin to know about her acceleration schedule, her safety factors. Damn it, I don't even know offhand the escape velocity of Mars." "It should take you all 2 minutes to work that out," Camilo interrupted. "I dare say, but there are a hell of a lot of things we can't work out without the data. Some of it we'll be able to get from Raul's technical papers, no doubt, but there are bound to be all kinds of questions arising that we shall need advice about." Said Camilo, doubtfully. His eyes strayed toward one of the ports for a moment, and then came back to me, looking suspicious again. "You didn't talk to them while you were out there?" he asked. "Oh, hell," I said impatiently and unwisely. "Look, there's nothing out there, nothing but sand. Come out with me and see for yourself." He shook his head slowly and gave me the smile of a man who knows a trick worth 2 of that. I was at a loss to know what line to take next. After I had thought about it a bit, it seemed to me that we were not going to get far while he was worried by these Martian phantoms, and the sooner they could be laid, the better. Perhaps I was wrong there. Perhaps I ought simply to have waited, hoping that the effect of the concussion would wear off. After all, except for the anxiety that must be going on at the other end of our radio link, there was no pressing hurry. The sun charger would keep our batteries up, even at this distance from the sun. Water is on an almost closed circuit with very little loss. Air regeneration too. There was victualling enough to last 2 of us for 18 months. I could have waited. But it is one thing to consider a situation retrospectively, and quite another to be at close quarters with a single companion who is slightly off his head and wondering whether time is likely to make him better or worse. However, as the radio seemed to be in some way entangled in his mind with the intentions of his cunning Martians, I decided to lay aside that subject of the moment and try tackling him on his other speciality. I pulled out a lump of the cake sand that I had brought inside and handed it to him. "What do you reckon that is?" I asked. He gave it the briefest of glances. "Hematite. Fe2O3, he said, looking at me as if I had asked a pretty stupid question. "Mars," he said, patiently, "is practically all oxides of one kind or another. This will be the commonest." "I've been thinking," I said. "One of our main objects, after getting here at all, is to bring in a preliminary report on the geology of Mars. Areology. He corrected me. You can't possibly talk about the geology of Mars. Doesn't make sense. All right, areology, I agreed, finding his lucidity encouraging and irritating at the same time. Well, we can at least make a start on that. There's a dark line on the horizon over that way that wants looking into. Might be vegetation of some kind. If we get the platform out, we could have a look at it, and the topography in general, too. I made the suggestion with a casual air, and awaited his answer with some anxiety, for I felt that if I could use his geological, or areological, interest to lure him outside, even a brief expedition might serve to dispel this notion of lurking Martians, and once that had been achieved, he would be willing to get on with the repair of the radio. He did not reply immediately, and I restrained myself from looking up for fear of seeming anxious enough to rouse his suspicions. At last, when I had started to consider the next step, he said, "They wouldn't be able to reach us once the platform lifted, would they?" "Of course not, if they are there at all. I've not seen one yet," I said, trying not to give any encouraging support to his fancies. "I nearly saw one half a minute ago, but they're always just too damned quick. Blast them," he complained. "There'd be no hiding from overhead observation in this desert," I pointed out. "If they are there, we'll be able to spot them easily from the platform." "If," he began indignantly, and then stopped, apparently struck by an idea. After a pause, he went on in quite a different tone. "All right. Yes, that's a good idea. Let's locate the platform and start getting it out." His change of front was sudden enough to make me look at him in astonishment. His expression now was enthusiastic, and he gave an encouraging nod. Apparently, I had chosen the right line, though I hoped he would not back off the idea with the same unexpectedness that he had veered onto it. At the moment, however, he was certainly all for it, and pulled a file of papers out of a locker. "The loading plan ought to be here," he said. "I'm pretty sure the platform was stowed in number 2 hold section." It was soon pretty clear that Camilo's "let's" was a manner of speaking. What he meant was that I should get the platform out. I made one attempt at persuading him to put on a spacesuit and give me a hand, but he was so clearly averse to that I gave up rather than risk having him turn against the whole idea. Once I had it assembled and he could step straight onto it, I could lift it at once and show him that nothing could be lurking in that desert. So presently, I went out alone and opened up number 2 hold section to get the platform out. There had been something of a tussle over the provision of a jet platform for us. The type that had proved itself on the moon over 50 years ago would not do. There, an object has only 1/6 of its Earth weight. On Mars, it weighs double its moon weight, and therefore, any carrier must be heavier and more powerful. A wheeled vehicle would have been much lighter, but we were opposed to that for use on an unknown terrain. A platform could skim safely above any kind of surface, and my father had supported us. In the end, he had designed a suitable platform in 3 sections that were dispatched to Primera to be stowed aboard the Figurão when she called there. Thus, for the main lift, we had been spared the weight of the biggest single piece of equipment that we carried, and could simply jettison it on Mars when we took off for the return. I found the 3 main sections, even at their Martian weight, quite as much as I wanted to handle, encumbered by my spacesuit. Once I had them laid out side by side on the sand, however, the bolting together was comparatively easy. Camilo had switched on the helmet radio belonging to one of the other spacesuits. From time to time, he inquired, "Have you seen any of them yet?" Each time I assured him that I had not, but somehow, whether he answered or remained silent, he managed to convey skepticism. When the main floor was assembled, I went ahead with fixing the control pillar. Thoroughly absorbed in the job, I lost all sense of my surroundings, remembering the empty stillness only when Camilo spoke. But when, after some 2.5 hours, I had the assembly complete and needing only a final check before the mounting of the fuel containers, my attention slackened, and, with that, the bleakness and loneliness all about seemed to press closer and crowd me. I decided I had put in a long enough spell outside for one day, and would be wiser to get back to the familiarity of the ship and the comfort of a meal before the Willies could encroach enough to trouble me badly. As I came through the airlock, I found Camilo seated on the pull-out stool in front of my charting board. He turned round and watched me attentively. When I took off the helmet, he seemed to relax and looked somewhat relieved. I glanced at the radio transmitter, hoping that he might have started to tackle that, but it was clear that it had not been touched. He asked how things were going and nodded when I told him. We'll need the two-man dome and gear for it, and of course the fuel containers. Might as well unload the lot of them while you're at it. Just as well to have them stacked handy. No point in leaving them in the ship. And some cases of food and bottles of water and steady on, I protested. We shan't be going on a week's expedition right away. All I expect to do tomorrow is to try the thing out and perhaps have a short flip over to see what the dark line is. We can take the dome and some food against an emergency, but there's no point in loading up useless extra weight. Tomorrow, he repeated. There's about 5 hours of light yet. Possibly, I admitted, but I've just done nearly 3 hours steady work in a spacesuit. If you are so anxious to hurry it on, you try a shift on the job yourself. I had scarcely expected him to rise to that, and he didn't. Instead, he watched me for a minute or two without speaking while I collected some food. Then, he went back to looking out of the window. He'd stand there, motionless, peering intently for a time. Then, he would suddenly turn his head quickly from side to side, like a spectator watching an unnaturally fast rally at a tennis match, and draw his breath in quickly. After that, there would be another motionless interlude for a bit. I was already edgy from the spell outside, and it soon began to get on my nerves. You won't see anything, I told him. Come over here and have some food. Rather surprisingly, he came without demur. I suppose you told them to keep out of sight, he said. Well, they're doing it, but they aren't fooling me. Oh, for God's sake, I began, letting my temper slip a bit at last. All right, he said hurriedly. Perhaps they told you not to let on about them. It doesn't matter, really. Comes to the same thing. I gave up trying to follow that and simply grunted. During the rest of the meal, and after it, we maintained a state of tactful truce. But when this had been disturbed, some 5 times by his leaping to a port in an attempt to catch his Martians unaware, I was driven to suggesting a game of chess to keep our attention occupied. It worked pretty well, too. For a time, he seemed to forget all about hostile Martians, played a well-considered game, and beat me by a better margin than usual. At the end of it, things felt much more normal until he remarked, That's just it, you see. You Martians are cunning, all right, but not quite cunning enough. We can beat you every time if we put our minds to it. The next morning, I went outside and finished checking over the platform. Then I got a couple of fuel containers out of the hold section and mounted them. Camilo, watching through the port, repeated on the helmet radio his suggestion of unloading them all. I appreciated that by lightening the ship there would be an advantage when it came to an attempt to raise her to the vertical, but they were heavy, and I did not see why I should do all the work. That part could wait until Camilo was in a state where he was willing to come out and help. I did add a case of food, a couple of bottles of water, and also the 2-man Flanders dome, for it isn't much good carrying rations against an emergency unless you also provide somewhere to take off your helmet so that you can eat them. And then there had to be the recompression gear to deflate the dome after use, and a matter of half a dozen small standby air bottles for the suits. Altogether, it took me nearly an hour to stow and make fast that lot. But then, at last, I was ready to make a test. I stepped aboard and told Camilo to stand by and observe. I tried the underjets individually first, and they all responded satisfactorily. Then I put them in concert. The platform throbbed and a large cloud of red dust blew out from beneath it. It lifted, slightly up by the near right-hand corner. I trimmed and leveled her off about 18 inches above the ground. Then, when she was stabilized, took her up to 10 feet. At that height, I slanted and slid her a bit in each direction, and she answered well. She felt more solid and steadier than a lunar-type platform, a little less sensitive too. Better that than the other way, I thought. I raised her to 100 feet or so with a smooth lift. From there, I had a real view. The dark line was revealed as no longer just a line, but as a wide stretch of darker ground reaching away into the distance. To the north and to the south, the desert was spread out in utter monotony. But on the eastern horizon, there were hills, once mountains perhaps, but now ground down and rounded off like very old molars. I reported to Camilo, but he was not interested in the landscape. He demanded, "Can you see any of them?" "No," I told him. "There aren't any." "I don't believe you." "Very well, just put on a spacesuit and come up and see for yourself," I suggested. "Oh, no, you don't. I wasn't born yesterday. That's how you got Jeff." "What the hell are you talking about? I am Jeff," I protested. "Heh, it's no good trying that on me. I know your game, and it's not going to work this time." "But look here, Camilo, I know what happened. When poor old Jeff went outside, soon after we landed, you were waiting for him. You jumped him, invaded him, turned the real Jeff out, and you've been using his body as a disguise. But I spotted you right away. Now you want to get me outside so that another of you can do the same to me. Well, you aren't going to bring that off. Poor old Jeff hadn't been warned, but I have, so it won't work." I started to bring the platform down. "Camilo," I told him, "stop talking a lot of bloody nonsense. There's a good fellow. If you don't know me after being cooped up with me all these weeks, you damned well ought to. I never heard such a fantastic, rubbishy—" "Oh, you put up a very good show," said Camilo generously. "Very cunning you are, but it's just because I do know Jeff so well that I could spot you." I hovered at a foot or so and let her down gently. She made a nice, easy touch, though she blew a cartload of dust about. "I've seen through your little idea, too," he went on. "You've spotted a chance to get away from this god-forsaken planet, and I don't blame you. Anybody in his senses would do his best to get off this ball of sand. So you want to take over this ship and get to Earth on her, but you aren't going to do it. Not this time, you're not." I tried my most authoritative voice. "Lieutenant Botões," I ordered, "put on a suit and come out here." He laughed. "Think you've got me, don't you? You toppled the ship over, killed Raul. Then you pushed Jeff out of himself and took him over. I'm the only obstacle now, aren't I? But you haven't got me yet. I'll soon show you." Then there was a clang that hurt my ears. I guessed he had been holding the helmet to speak into its radio and had now dropped it. Then I saw the outer door of the lock swing shut. I ran to it and battered on it, telling him not to be a fool. I had the winding key to open it from outside, but it would be no good trying that for a minute or more. To attempt it while the automatic mechanism was still securing it would simply have taken me round with the handle. I went to the port. It was just a little too high for me to see in, so I jumped in order to get a glimpse of what he was up to. At the same moment, the port went blank as the cover closed. I hurried back to the airlock door, put the key in, and began to wind the locking bolts back. The telltale inside must have shown him what I was up to, for the key suddenly reversed in my hands as the mechanism started again. I swore and snatched it out. "Camilo!" I called, hoping my voice would reach him from the dropped helmet. "Camilo, you've got it all wrong! Don't be a damn fool! Let me in!" His only reply was, very faintly, a jeering laugh. "Camilo!" I was beginning again, when suddenly the ship trembled, and there was a huge spurt of dust and sand forward. I hadn't a moment's doubt what that meant, and I ran for my life. Even encumbered with the suit, I covered the ground with great, leaping strides, a dozen yards long, and was some 80 yards away in a few seconds before I misjudged my step and fell. Still sprawling, I looked back at the figurão. A cloud of dust and sand was spurting from beneath her forepart. Some of the grit was pattering on my helmet. As I watched, the forepart swayed and then lifted clear off the ground. Most of the loose stuff had been blown away, and I could see the ship better now, well enough to guess what Camilo was trying to do. The 3 lowermost steering jets were blasting fiercely as they lifted her nose. I could see the idea, but I doubted whether he would get enough thrust out of those small jets to push her back to the vertical. He turned up the power, and she lifted a little more on the 2 exposed legs of the tripod, no longer nose down, but tilted a little above the horizontal. I judged he had the jets on full power. They were holding her up, making a 3rd supporting leg, but they weren't raising her nose any further. I suddenly understood why he had been so anxious to have the platform out of her, and the fuel, and the rest of the stuff too. Freed of them, she might just have had power enough, but with most of the gear still aboard, she was still inclined only very slightly above the horizontal. The jets kept on roaring and gushing, but still they gave her no more lift. I wondered if it was the leg that had broken through the crust that was keeping her anchored. Clearly, she was not going to be able to make it. Then the main drive fired. Crazy. Crazy. I suppose he thought that if he could tear the buried leg free, the side jets would be able to tilt her nose skyward. She leapt forward, almost horizontal, and with the pediment of the trailing leg dragging a furrow through the sand like a huge plowshare. She dipped by the head, bounced her belly on the sand, rose again on the supporting side jets, and he let the main drive have it again. By God, it was well tried. For a moment, I thought he had done it. She lifted until the foot of the trailing leg was barely touching the sand. She was accelerating fast, but at such an angle to me that I could see little more than a cloud of dust with an exhaust flare in the middle of it. She must, I suppose, have dipped again and touched. I can't say. All I saw was the silver shape leaping suddenly above the dust cloud, turning over and over in the air with her drive still flaring. She fell back into the dust and bounced to appear again. She didn't go so high, and she was spinning differently this time. Then, once more, she disappeared, and the dust and the sand sprayed up, looking like a shell burst at sea. I put down my head, hugged myself to the ground, and waited. She was, I guessed, nearly 3 miles away by now, but that was unpleasantly close for the kind of explosion I was expecting. I held my breath as I waited, and waited. The explosion did not come. At last, I looked up, cautiously. Of the figurão herself, I could see nothing. There was just a dust cloud, with a red flare still burning steadily in the middle of it. I went on, waiting. Nothing happened, except that the lighter dust was blown away and the cloud grew smaller. After some more minutes, I risked standing up. Scarcely taking my eyes from the spot, I made my way back to the platform. I found it half buried in sand thrown up by the figurão's blast, but it lifted all right, and the sand slid off as I tilted it and slid it away to a safer distance to land again. For over an hour, I sat on the platform, watching. Gradually, the loose sand and dust had been blown away, and I could see the silver glint of the ship herself and the steady flame from her tubes. I realized that somehow, perhaps on the first bounce, the main drive had been reduced to a pretty low power, or the ship would have gone a lot further and fared a lot worse, but I still did not know whether she was going to blow up or not, and, if not, how long the fuel would continue to burn at the present setting. Perhaps Camilo had been able to check the power at the moment of the first bounce, but he could have had no chance after that. One could not imagine that, even strapped to the couch as he would be, either himself or the gimbal system could have withstood what the figurão had been through. And at that thought, I was suddenly swept by the terrifying realization that, whether the ship blew up or not, I was now alone. Almost in the same moment, I became aware again of the hostile desert all around. I began to feel the awfulness of utter desolation stalking in on me once more. I pulled the 2-man dome off the platform and set it up. Flimsy though it was, one could find some illusion of protection inside it. The howling of the wilderness was not quite so close to my elbow, The prowling of the agoraphobic monsters was kept a little further off. The day wore on. The puny red sun declined and disappeared. The constellations shone out, familiar still, for against the panorama of the heavens, the leap from Earth to Mars is the tiniest of hops. One day, I am sure, the constellations will look different, when our hops have indeed become great leaps. For me, that is an article of faith, but it won't be for a long time yet. The night closed down. Through the dome's small windows, all but the stars was dark, except at one point where, across miles of sand, I could see the glow of the Figurão's main jet, still flaring where she lay. I broke open a packet of rations and ate some food. I felt no hunger, but the familiarity of the simple act of eating held some comfort. The food did me good, too. It gave me strength, and I felt better able to resist. Then, suddenly, I became aware of silence. Looking out of the window again, I saw that the flare of the rocket tube had vanished. There was nothing but blackness and the stars. All sound had ceased, and left such a silence as was never known on Earth. Nor was it just that, not just a negative absence of sound. The silence was hard, positive, a quality of eternity itself. It rang in one's ears until they sought relief by hearing sounds that did not exist, murmurings, far-off bells, sighs not so far off, tickings, whispers, faint ululations. A bit of verse that my grandfather used to quote came into my mind. For all the night I heard their thin gnat voices cry, star to faint star across the sky. And I seemed to hear them too. They had no words. They were on the threshold of sound, but they encouraged me. And God knows I needed encouragement, crouched there in my flimsy dome. The voices cry, but the elemental terrors prowl. We need numbers to sustain us. In numbers, we can dispel the terrors. Alone, we are weak, mutilated. Taken from our pool of corporate strength, we gasp. We wriggle defenselessly while the terrors circle round, slowly closing in. Perhaps the voices are just sirens, but I think not. I think they are calls of destiny, leading, not luring, onward and outward. I think we must follow them, but not like this. Never again like this. Not, oh God, alone. The little sun rode over the horizon like a delivering knight. I almost knelt in worship of him as he drove the fingering terrors from my side. Not away, but further off, giving me the room and the courage to move. I had meant to eat again, but I could not wait for that. I craved only the security of the ship. I put my helmet on with shaking hands, packed the dome aboard the platform, lifted to a few feet, and sped across the sand towards the Figurão as fast as I could. 2 of the tripod legs were twisted and bent, and the third torn off, but the whole was surprisingly little damaged. I had to clear a lot of sand to get at the airlock as the ship now lay. Much of it I managed to blow away with the platform's jets, but the rest I had to scrape out. The lock worked perfectly. Inside the ship, there was far less damage than I had expected, except to poor Camilo. I take some pride in having been able to force myself outside again to bury him as I had buried Raul. I knew that it must be done at once if I were to be able to face it at all, so somehow I did it, and then hurried back. It was after that the gap comes. A long gap, according to the calendar clock. It looks as if I spent some part of it trying to repair the radio transmitter. For some reason, I seem to have rigged up a light to shine out of each port. The platform is still outside, but not quite as I left it when I first came in. Probably there are other things. I don't know. I can't remember. Perhaps someone will come. I have food enough for nearly 3 years. Food enough, but not, I fear, spirit enough. There is a letter here from my dear Isabella. Give it to her, please.